Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the January 2021 Lamoille County Democratic Committee meeting. I want to first wish everyone a Happy New Year. And we know that this coming year is going to be a lot better in so many ways than 2020, particularly when just 16 days, we're going to have a new president and vice president, which will then begin to show some real leadership in terms of getting our country out of this pandemic that has really, stifled our economy and killed so many of our fellow Americans. It's been a tragedy. It's really been a result of a lack of leadership from the Trump administration that the death toll is so high and that the pandemic is so far-reaching and devastating to so many Americans. We know that this year promises to be not without its challenges, but we're going to be really headed in the right direction. So having said that, we're really grateful tonight to have some of our elected representatives, democratically elected Democratic representatives from Lamoille County who are serving us in the State House to give us their perspective on the upcoming legislative session. This is a real challenge, I think. We're still in the pandemic. There's budget situations that they have to deal with. But I'm not going to talk any more about that. They'll fill us in on all those types of issues. And when we get done, we'll take some questions if anybody has them. So I'd like to start out with our two representatives from Lamoille, Washington. That's Dave Iacovone and Avram Pat. Dave, you want to kick it off?
I'd be glad to. And I'm assuming you'd like us to keep this to 2 or 3 minutes, Bruce?
Well, yeah, no more than five, I think, if that's,
I'll try to be
whatever you feel you need time to do.
Well, if I notice people start nodding off, I'll certainly cut it short. How's that? Thank you. Thank you for letting me speak here. I just wanted to briefly touch on some of the priorities that I see coming up in this session. And those priorities in large part, of course, are driven by the pandemic and how it has exposed the fragility of our economy across many fronts, including broadband, cell service, housing, hunger, childcare, the service sector, including the gig economy, tourism. They're all suffering and need help. Additionally, higher education, public and private, are struggling and need significant attention. While I'll do my best to address those issues, it's clear to me that we need a plan to assure our economic future is successful. In the 1970s, for instance, Vermont invested in industrial parks across the state, helping to build the infrastructure with water, sewer, and roads. Conscious decision was made, and that was a plan. We have to ask ourselves what the next strategic investments are to help strengthen our economic future and preserve, especially in my mind, rural Vermont. In short, we need a vision and a plan so our economy is not left to chance. I think it was the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland who said, and I paraphrase, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. We need a blueprint. We need a roadmap. We need a vision. I haven't seen one. So I think we need a Vermont Economic Solutions Act. There's many other issues that I'll be focusing on, but that's the 50,000 top level one that I'll be speaking to. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Dave. Avram?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having this meeting and for everybody who's listening in. Before I start, I do want to thank Bruce Olsson for his service as chair of the county committee and bringing a lot of new energy and organization to that job. And now that he's the chair of the state committee, I look forward to your contribution there as well. Thank you, Bruce. So in this coming year, the first year of this biennium, we will by necessity be concentrating and spending, I'm going to say, the majority of our time dealing with COVID-19 one way or the other, whether it's allocating federal funds, dealing with state programs, state funding, the impact of COVID-19 on our budget and our revenue, all of these things, in addition to the impact that it has on individual Vermonters and businesses that we all know the impact that it has. So by necessity, that is going to take up a lot of our time. And given our experience in this past year, when we're dealing with federal funds that come in very large dollar amounts, all of a sudden, with sometimes ambiguous or conflicting rules and restrictions and timeframes about it, there's a certain amount of unintended consequences, fixes. We have to go back and say, oh, we left these people out. We didn't mean to do that. We'll be spending a lot of time doing that kind of stuff. I do believe that it's important, and this is how I look at things, is to keep our eyes on the prize. What were our priorities before COVID-19 happened? Because those are my priorities through this crisis, and they will be after that. And we can't just be dominated by this crisis as much as we must spend time and dollars and energy dealing with it in the coming months and the year or so. Some of the things that I have worked on specifically, and I expect will continue to be, we'll find out what our committee assignments are in a day or so, 2 days or so. I've been both in the legislature and in my work career before that, spent a great deal of time and energy and learned a lot and have expertise in energy issues, both electric utility as well as fossil fuel transportation and all of that. And climate change is affecting us in Vermont. It is costing us in Vermont every day now. Talk to people, your local road commissioners and your utility line workers. They know that effect has been happening and is going to be getting worse before hopefully we turn it around and it starts getting better. So that's a major focus of mine, something I feel I can contribute to. And the other that the committee I've been on, the Energy and Transportation Committee, is broadband. I think everyone understands what that means to people, what the lack of it means to people. It's been only heightened by this crisis, with so many Vermonters, students and parents and employees are working at home, and they have to go to a hotspot and sit in their car in order to work or study because they can't do it at home. And that happens throughout the 4 towns in the Lamoille, Washington district. In every single one of our towns, I have heard from lots of people about that. And the solution, in part, is what the legislature established a few years ago, is the communication union districts. These are districts made up of municipalities. Morristown is in one of them. It happens that Woodbury and Worcester and Elmore are in the CV fiber district, but that is how we're going to get around the obstacles that have prevented us from having real high-speed internet to the last mile in rural Vermont. So I'm going to be spending a lot of time on that, but also paying close attention to what other committees are doing in terms of COVID-19 and everything else as they bring things to the floor that I will have to vote on, even though I did not spend a lot of time on it in my committee. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer questions later.
Okay, thank you, Avram. So let's now move to Lamoille 2. and that's Dan Noyes and Kate Donnelly. Dan, you want to kick us off?
Sure, Bruce. Thanks, and Happy New Year to everybody. So I hopefully will be back on the Human Services Committee. As Avram said, we'll be getting our committee assignments on Wednesday. Looking forward to seeing where I end up. A couple of the bills that I'm working on for this session, obviously very concerned about the issues that we're going to be dealing with around the impact COVID has had on our state. I am working with Teresa Wood from Waterbury on Older Vermonters Nutrition Act. Over the past year, our Meals on Wheels programs and senior centers have really been having to provide a lot more nutrition services to older Vermonters. And we should be looking at how those services are working and how that money is, how much money is out there to provide these. And it's not only just Meals on Wheels, but it's through economic services and the Three Squares programs and making sure that people can use those dollars and not have to go into a grocery store because of COVID. So there's some other things within that. We're also looking at whether the Medicaid could be used to help pay for some of the meals as a way to use some federal dollars to help offset some state dollars to the cost of the meals. I had a meeting on that today with the AAAs and Teresa Wood. I'm looking at some legislation around a rate increase for home and community-based providers. These are the people that work for home health and provide in-home care for older Vermonters, and just making sure that they're adequately compensated for the work that they're doing. It's important work, and we're always looking at, in that minimum wage vote that we had, it was very concerning to me that we wanted to make sure that these individuals were able to not lose their jobs because there's only so much money in the system. Actually, Representative Iacovone has an excellent bill that I'm glad to sign on to around a long-term care trust fund study that will hopefully bring more money into long-term care. I'm working on a bill to have recovery housing, and we know that there's been a lot more addiction issues around housing over COVID. So we're looking at how we can set up recovery houses in rural areas where people can live and help get treatment. Working with Jenna's Promise and the folks in Johnson on that particular bill, along with others in the recovery housing. I'm also working on a bill to create the Office of the Child Advocate. So this is kind of looking at like an ombudsman program for DCF and helping youth in foster care transition to adulthood and make sure that they have the tools and the skills that they need and the supports they need from DCF. So that's a bill that I've been working on for a couple of years, and hopefully we'll see some movement on it. I know that system has been under strain with the impact that we've had recently. Obviously, a lot of things that were already brought up, I'm very concerned about: childcare, the cell service, and the fiber. It's even hard to be legislating here in Lamoille County when we don't have adequate bandwidth to run Zoom meetings on some days. And obviously, our state college system, we have to make sure that makes it through this downturn. So I'll just leave it at that. Looking forward to any questions, or if anyone wants to reach out to me, glad to talk about some of the legislation I'm working on. Oh, just one more thing. The Older Vermonters Caucus, which is a group of legislators that meet Wednesday afternoons, will be focusing this year on the Older Vermonters Act, which is some legislation we passed last session. There's some studies in there, and there's also kind of a long-term plan to look at how we provide care to older Vermonters, and we want to make sure that is implemented. So I'll just leave it at that. We got an intern to help us with that from UVM. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Next, we're going to go to Kate Donnelly from Hyde Park, who is the newest member of our delegation. Ran a great race this fall, and very happy to have her on board. And Kate, you want to give us your perspective as being a new rep and how you see things working out?
Sure. Thank you, Bruce. Thanks for the kind introduction and the invitation to be here. Yeah, as Bruce mentioned, my name is Kate Donnelly. I will be serving alongside Dan Noyes, representing Belvedere, Johnson, Hyde Park, and Wolcott. And as a new legislator, I certainly, and, coupled with being a therapist, I sort of anticipate that in the coming months, I'll be doing a lot of listening. But I think it's clear to me already when we talk about the priorities this upcoming year, sort of globally, legislators are going to talk about, the budget and COVID recovery. But I think what's interesting to think about and look at is like, what does that mean exactly? And I think Dave Giacavone spoke to this, that, we will be bringing our values and our priorities to those discussions. COVID recovery isn't some sort of unilateral thing. It involves so many different things. And so what does that look like? What does that mean exactly? There's the immediate short-term needs, and then there's the longer-term needs, and a lot of issues that have been highlighted by COVID. I was just looking at, I'm just going to take a second to read it because I was just got an email about the report of the local support and action team of the governor's COVID-19 recovery task force. This group did interviews with more than 1,000 Vermonters across 14 counties, and they found common themes, quote, that the pandemic had, quote, highlighted or exacerbated fundamental challenges long faced by Vermonters, the loss of use and economic stagnation in many communities, racial and economic disparities, and the unmet needs of families, seniors, and children. Quote, we've frequently heard skepticism about getting back to normal, the report continued. To many, normal was not a sustainable place to get back to. In fact, the pandemic is a galvanizing crucible that's testing and calling on Vermonters for a new dedication to address fundamental needs for a new and vibrant future. And I just felt like, it was a really nice quote. I don't know if folks are familiar with that task force. If they're not, I'm happy to provide their reports. It was they did a lot of work to connect with folks around what's been working in different counties and what hasn't been working. And I think, they do an eloquent job of describing the fact that COVID really brought to bear a lot of inequities that already existed in our system. And so I think that part of our challenge as the legislature moving forward is going to be looking at, again, not only how do we ensure that in the short term people have what they need to survive, but how do we make sure that we use this opportunity to also address some of these other really large systemic infrastructure issues like childcare, like broadband, so that, when COVID is in the rearview mirror, it will happen someday, I think, I swear, we can look forward to a brighter economic future. So outside of that, I think the one other thing that I'll mention, there's so many things, but other folks have mentioned them already, that I think is worth putting sort of on the radar of this group. One of the bills that I think is going to be popping up is related to a weighting study due to education funding. And I think that this is a bill that folks in our district certainly will want to sort of keep an eye on, because essentially a report was generated, I think in 2019, that looked at the current weighting system, which determines essentially how much each community should be, like the cost of providing education per pupil. And what they found was that the formulas that determine these weights have not been adequately or accurately representing the actual cost for certain communities, well, specifically for meeting specific needs. For example, if someone lives in poverty, they're often going to require a higher level of support in schools. And so the cost of that support was not adequately represented in the formula, among other things. What this translates into, the reason I'm talking about it right now, is that this has disproportionately impacted many rural communities, ours included. And there's a lot of, again, information I can share with folks who are interested that shows that if we were to shift the weights to something that better represents the actual cost of providing education to pupils. Our district, and I haven't looked at the numbers for Abram and Dave's district, but there would be a pretty notable drop in tax rate. And so again, just something to sort of keep an eye out for, and happy to talk to folks about it if they have further questions, and I will stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Let's open it up for questions. Does anybody have a question? Marina.
I wonder if someone wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing on the climate change environmental front, because to me that is an overarching issue, and being in Stowe, and I know that we've had many years where there's little snow in the over Christmas, but you know, climate change is marching on, the lake is still polluted. What are we doing? I know that the governor did not sign on to the Regional Transportation Act, but if somebody wants to speak to what the plans are there, I would very much appreciate it. And I'll mute myself again.
Anybody want to answer that? Avram?
Yeah, I'll start by saying the short answer is not enough. As I think people know, in this last session, we did pass the Global Warming Solution Act. It passed out of the House Energy and Technology Committee in February, shortly before we went, took a break and then went online, and things changed. But the Senate did pass it substantially as the House sent it to them late in the session in the summertime, and it passed over the governor's objections, but nevertheless. That would create I would say an aggressive plan for reducing the carbon footprint of Vermonters in a number of different ways. It would require that the state meet certain targets, which have been simply goals that were not taken seriously in the past, and the areas that we need to tackle, I would say primarily start with transportation, but because that is by far at this point the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, followed by heating. Our electric utility industry has made very substantial progress across all the utilities in Vermont over the years in reducing the carbon coming from the energy generation that Vermont utilities use, and in large part due to something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, RGGI, and I'll get to that in talking about the Transportation Climate Initiative. So over the next 2-3 years, I expect to see a lot of changes happening in how, in both in terms of regulation as well as in incentives. And the legislature is not limited by doing what the council that this bill establishes set up. We are going to be passing some legislation, I expect, this year as well, regardless of what comes from them in the next few years. So let me say something about the Transportation Climate Initiative, TCI. Incredibly disappointing that Governor Scott is not joining on with other states at this point. He's been really largely absent and misunderstanding what this is all about. It is modeled after the regional greenhouse gas initiative that Governor Jim Douglas entered Vermont into a number of years ago in the 1990s, which has played a large part in why Vermont electric utilities have reduced the greenhouse gas emissions from the sources of energy used in Vermont. It works. It works on a regional basis, which is really the most effective way to do it. And I'll close with saying a lot of people who don't want to do anything are always saying, well, what can Vermont do? We're such a tiny little place. We could do everything right and it won't make any difference. And on the one hand, that's true. We could do everything right, and if everyone else does nothing, then climate changes will continue because we don't have a lot of impact just within the political borders of our little state with a low population. We need to look at dealing with climate change on a per capita basis, because on a per capita basis, and in particular due to transportation, our greenhouse gas emissions in the last 20 years went up. On an average basis, not each and every one of us, but on an average basis, Vermont individuals were emitting more greenhouse gases from transportation than they had been previously. So that's how we need to look at it. That's how everybody else in the world needs to look at it, not by the political boundaries of states and countries that were established before people used electricity or fossil fuels, because greenhouse gas emissions in New Hampshire affect the global climate just as much as greenhouse gas emissions per capita do from China or India or Vermont or California or anywhere else. So we're working on it, but climate change has happened. It is affecting us. It is affecting ski areas. We heard testimony in our committee about controlling floodwaters with particular emphasis on areas in Lamoille County that I think people know have been hit hard by increased flooding. Electric utilities know that the weather changed over the last 15, 20 years, and that outages are now more severe and more frequent than they used to be. So it's already happened. The question is, can we slow it down, stop it, and turn it around? I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Avram. Are there any other questions? Well, I have a question about the state budget. I know there was talk about or hope that the latest stimulus package that was passed was going to provide aid to states. That did not happen. I know Mitch McConnell was opposed to doing something like that. And I just wonder if anybody can give us kind of an overview of what the state budget situation looks like at this time. I know, Dave, did you want to? Okay, thank you, Dave.
I can jump in. I thought you were going to ask, does anybody have a solution? And I was going to say the solution's in Georgia. And that's pretty frightening.
Right.
But if Georgia doesn't do what we hope and frankly pray that they will do, our challenge is pretty dire. So our general fund, it's around $180 million deficit. And by that, I mean, if you take level spending and you assume those are all good things, it's a fair question whether they are or not. But if you wanted to continue them and with some other mandatory increases, such as pensions, et cetera, there's $180 million plus or minus shortfall. And our education fund, I think it's at the tune of around 65 million. So when you add those two together, it's approaching $250 million. We have approximately $200 million in all our reserve accounts, of which there are several. But you could collapse them into one and address that. So it's been difficult to accurately determine the revenues that we will have available because of the previous economic recovery funds. I'm going to call them recovery instead of stimulus. Some were and some were not. But to date, 4.8 billion, nearly $5 billion since last March has been pumped into Vermont in some form of relief, individual state governments, etc. That $5 billion on our total economy is quite significant, and it's generated, as you might expect, a lot of tax revenue and sales tax, etc. The current $900 billion national benefit and the amounts that Vermont will get from that will be difficult to determine. There'll be an estimate made. The economists are always cautious and conservative when they do that. I guess it's part of their DNA. No, because they don't know. What that means is, though, probably in the following year, as we have in the last 3 years, somebody will say, oh, we have a big surplus on hands and we'll use that. I believe that while there are those deficits I spoke of, and they're frightening, I believe there will be a significant amount of what we call one-time money available from this economic recovery, these economic recovery revenues that have come into Vermont. Now, Vermont, there was a period of many years, really, maybe over a decade, where Vermont used one-time dollars to budget our state budget. Not a good thing to do. We broke away from that in the last 4 to 6 years, where we haven't used one-time money to cover ongoing expenses. We've used one-time funds for investments until last year. So and Republicans and Democrats, liberals, conservative alike understood. They said, look, during a pandemic, it's okay to bridge your budget, prop it up with one-time money. We'll likely have to, in my opinion, have to do that again for another year until the dust settles and we have a better picture, including possibly some more help from Washington, even if it is a Republican Senate, although I'm pessimistic on that. The notion of trying to extract nearly $250 million out of our general fund and education fund to balance things, wrong word, would have a staggering impact because it would require a cost shift. Those expenses, many of them don't go away. The needs of a child to have a proper education and teachers and the counseling supports and everything else that goes into educating children properly do not go away. They will be shifted on the burdens of someone. Our highways and roads and our potholes, they do not go away. They'll be shifted on the shoulders of someone, probably our local communities. There will be, usually, I'm almost done, oftentimes during periods like this, there's calls for more revenues, whether it's a wealth tax or some type of a surcharge. Many will say this is the worst time to do that. There'll be a lot of rhetoric, forgive me for saying rhetoric. There'll be a lot of opinions, perhaps not based on data, that say will drive people out of Vermont if that happens. I'll note that roughly the same number of people from New Hampshire that has no income tax leave New Hampshire, as do Vermont. Might have some more to do with climate than our tax policy, but I digress. All of these issues will be in play. There's no easy answer. Does that help at all, Bruce, or just confused?
Well, no, it's just a little frightening. You know, if you think about the challenge we face as a state, it's definitely going to be, I'm glad I'm not in your shoes. Let me just say that. So I know that you're going to have some tough decisions to make as their representatives.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Maria? Maria, do you have a question? Unmute yourself.
Hi. Hi, good afternoon. Maria Davies, parent from Stowe, and also a committee member for the Stowe Dems. I just wanted to say, and this goes out to any representative really who wants to respond to it. So some of the things as I'm listening to you, and I am aware of a lot of the things such as um, what Representative Pat was saying about Reggie and the United States climate change and everything that's going on there, because I work a lot on these grants that we get, and we push money out the door with different climate initiatives. I work on the diesel emissions reduction grant program. And so I'm very well aware of the money that we get from EPA for these funds, as well as the Climate Alliance that we just joined. But one of the things that weighs on my mind are a couple of things. So the vaccine's out now. We're hoping to get some of it to get the Vermonters here vaccinated at some point in time. Kids, teachers, all the essential workers. But what weighs heavily on my mind are how we're going to distribute this equitably. So I'm talking about minorities as well as low income and the homeless. That just keeps me up at night, as well as the other portion of it is post-COVID. I hear so many parents asking me, because I also volunteer for another program called Healthy Lamoille Valley, and parents come to me and say, my kid is just depressed. I mean, they're so, just not really there. They're a shadow of a person. They're not doing anything. They're not active. They're really down. And that concerns me. And I hear it from several parents, not just in Stowe. And they're concerned. So I'm concerned because I feel that post-COVID, our kids are going to be mentally very, very challenged. And so I'm just wondering, how do we help this? And I want the representatives to know that these kids are going to come out of this COVID, when we have it in our rearview mirror, like Kate said, pretty bad. And I just want you to be prepared because it's coming.
I know this seems like a perfect question for Kate. I don't know if you'd want to answer that. I know it's kind of up your alley.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can say that I hear you. And I would say that the mental health strain extends to just about every human in Vermont and beyond, right? So, youth are having a very particular set of mental health concerns right now, particularly in adolescence, right? So much of that developmental stage of life is about connection outside of the family unit, and it's so restricted right now. I do know my wife actually works for the Department of Mental Health and is a part of a grant, the AWARE grant. Maria, I'm not sure if that popped on your radar or not. The AWARE grant, and I'm afraid to talk about it knowledgeably, but I'll do my best. But essentially, like, what their AWARE grant is working to do is build a much more comprehensive relationship between mental health and schools, the world of mental health and the world of schools. And so historically what we've had is a school, and then you have a therapist that gets plopped in the school. And sometimes that therapist is paid for by community mental health agency, and sometimes that therapist is paid for by the school. But essentially the way it has tended to operate is they almost operate as though they have a private practice within the school. It's pretty siloed in terms of, like, you have the accessibility of them being in that office. But what I think where things are moving, I hope, and certainly where the funding stream seems to be moving with a grant like AWARE, which is pretty comprehensive, is working on really building capacity within schools to adopt systems-wide approaches that integrate mental health care for youth from the ground up. So not like, you're a student, you're a student with a mental health problem, here, go see the therapist for 45 minutes once a week. But how do we really implement mental health reform within our school systems? And that's a really hard thing to do. I could spend another 45 minutes talking about the challenges associated with that. But what I guess what I'm trying to say is, the good news is, and this sort of speaks to what we were talking about before, is like, youth are suffering, and they've been suffering for a long time. And they've been suffering long before COVID. And speaking to Maria's point about equity, particular subsets of youth have been suffering exponentially for a long time, whether you're talking about LGBTQ youth, whether you're talking about BIPOC youth, and this also extends into the broader community as well. But, you know, the good news in a sense is that there has been a good amount of work that's been done to try to start shifting the way that we're approaching these issues. What's unfortunate is that, you know, AWARE is like a year old, right? So they're just like getting their footing. And what would have been amazing is if we had this kind of infrastructure in place 5 years ago, and it could have, you know, been in place to support youth right now. So I think from my experience locally, I think the schools are really aware that social emotional health and well-being is central. If you live in a space where that is not the message you're receiving from your principal or your schools, like if you feel like you're not, or you're getting feedback from parents that youth are not, that their social and emotional well-being is not being prioritized, I would say, let me know, because I have really open, active communication with superintendents and the principals in the area. And I think that leadership is really open to working to ensure that youth have what they need. It's just that the school professionals don't always know exactly what that is. And sometimes they need to bring folks in. I'll pause there. I'm not sure that it really speaks to your question, like legislatively, but I can tell you that, again, the groundwork is sort of being laid in terms of how to best support youth in the schools.
Thanks, Kate.
Okay, are there any other questions? Seeing none, then I guess we'll conclude this portion of our meeting and then go into the business.
Well, I would like.
Oh,
to
sure,
just
Linda,
thank-
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I would just like to really thank the legislators for their work, and it's going to be a hard session. As a former legislator, I know what it takes, and I'm really appreciative of them all stepping forward and doing this really hard work.
I would certainly agree with that. Yes, thank you all.
Thank you, Linda.
It's not an easy job.
Thank you, Lynn.
I would also, one other person I want to thank before we end this portion of the meeting is Dolan Patrick for all the work that he's done in terms of live streaming these events, all that, you know, the technical aspects, work that I would not know how to do, that I do not know how to do. And I think we owe Dolan a round of applause for all that good work he's done for these meetings. Thank you, Dolan. With that, if no one else has anything else, Dolan, I think we're ready to cut off the streaming. Is that okay? Are we all set? Done. Okay. Next, we're going to go into business